Okay, let's start with a review of your previous learning. Get a pen and paper. Don't you dare skip this section of the video. Pause the video, pen and paper, and then in 5 seconds, the answers will come up to these questions. So mark your questions. If you're struggling with anything, get onto Brainscape and learn the basics. So we're going to take a look now at cardiovascular disease. A big issue in Scotland. We've been learning about the cardiovascular system. Disease of the cardiovascular system is a massive issue in this country. So we're going to look at the following topics. The first one we're going to look at is atherosclerosis. So this is a process that leads to lots of other types of cardiovascular disease. So a lot of cardiovascular disease stems from atherosclerosis. So we need to understand what this process is. Pause the video, read the key learning points, and then we'll get going. So atherosclerosis is a process where plaques form within the arteries. And these plaques are made up of cholesterol, fibrous material, and calcium. And you can see in the diagram here, so this is an artery, and you can see that this red bit here is the wall of the artery, and the yellow bit is the lumen, or the hole that the blood would normally travel through. And you can see that this plaque, or this atheroma, has begun to develop within the wall of the artery, underneath the lining, this endothelium. So that's where this plaque develops. And it can lead to such things as strokes, heart attacks, something called peripheral vascular disease, which we'll talk about later, and can also lead to angina. So it's a gradual process. This plaque builds up over a period of time. And you can see that as the plaque builds up, that the lumen, the hole which the blood would normally travel through, gets smaller, which means that blood flow is restricted and blood pressure increases. Just another diagram showing what's happening. So there's the artery, there's the lumen that the blood would normally flow through. You can see the atheroma, or the plaque that has developed underneath the endothelium. That plaque, remember, is made up of cholesterol, fibrous material, and calcium. And you can see that blood flow is going to be restricted because of the narrowing of the blood vessel. Another thing that happens is the blood vessels, over a period of time, the atheroma becomes hard. And so the arteries lose their elasticity as well. Just another diagram showing the narrowing, if you like, of the artery. You can see the atheroma on either side here, but you can see how blood flow has been restricted through the lumen. So that's it for atherosclerosis. Pause and just check that you can explain and that you understand those key points. And if not, think what your questions need to be for your teacher. So let's move on to the next bit, which is thrombosis. So there's a link between atherosclerosis and thrombosis. Have a look at what time it is on the video now, because you're going to come back to this point. I can almost guarantee it. You'll need to rewind and listen to this explanation a few times. So we're going to learn what thrombosis is. It's a process that you need to understand. So pause the video and have a look at the key learning points for this section. So having looked at those learning points, you'll see there's a lot of words that sound similar. So that's why it's quite tricky, this section. So please do look at the video again and again and again and try and drill it in. So normally, the body protects itself. When there's damage to cells, blood clotting takes place. So if you normally think of a cut on the surface of the skin, eventually you stop bleeding, don't you? And you have a scab develop to stop the blood from escaping your body. Well, that's a form of clotting, of blood clotting. And that helps to protect the body in that situation. But that process can happen inside the body as well. So yes, you can cut yourself on the surface, but cells can be damaged within the body as well. And that's what we're going to talk about. So this is the link really with atherosclerosis. So this is the diagram of atherosclerosis again. So what happens is that over a period of time, this atheroma develops, this plaque develops underneath the endothelium, until eventually the atheroma ruptures and the endothelium cells are damaged. And that damage to those cells is what triggers this process of thrombosis. So what happens? Well, these damaged cells release a substance called clotting factor. And the clotting factor causes an inactive enzyme called prothrombin to be converted into an active enzyme called thrombin. So I'll say that again. The damage to the cells releases clotting factors, and the clotting factors stimulate the inactive enzyme, prothrombin, to be converted into the active enzyme, thrombin. So we've got the first bit that we talked about just previously. So there's the clotting factors converting prothrombin into thrombin. So the next thing that happens is that thrombin, now an active enzyme, is converting a soluble plasma protein called fibrinogen into strands that are insoluble, or threads that are insoluble, called fibrin. Now it's fibrin that creates the mesh that basically causes these clots to form. So if you look at the diagram here, this is the clot or the thrombus forming. Well, these yellow strands that create the mesh for the clot to form, or for the thrombus to form, these are the fibrin strands. So this whole process of forming a clot or forming a thrombus is called thrombosis. So just to review it, so damage is caused by the rupture of the atheroma, which is caused by atherosclerosis. That damages the endothelium cells. The damaged cells cause the release of clotting factors. The clotting factors convert an inactive enzyme, prothrombin, into an active enzyme called thrombin. And then the thrombin then converts fibrinogen into fibrin. And fibrin are those fibers that make up the thrombus or the clot. I told you you'd need to rewind this. So again, just a summary. Atherosclerosis is taking place and the atheroma or the plaque is developing underneath the endothelium. Eventually the atheroma ruptures, breaks through the endothelium. The endothelium cells are damaged, and that causes the clotting factors to be released. The clotting factors convert the prothrombin into thrombin, which is the active enzyme. And then the thrombin converts fibrinogen into fibrin, and that creates this thrombus or a clot. So pause the video. You'll probably need to rewind and go through that again, and a number of times, I would imagine. But think carefully. What are your questions? Use these statements on this slide to think carefully what your questions are. So we've learnt about atherosclerosis and we've learnt about thrombosis, two processes. They're linked, but two processes that can also lead to other cardiovascular issues. So we're going to take a look now at some of these other cardiovascular issues. So pause the video and again have a look at the key learning points before we move on. So we've learnt an atheroma develops, or a plaque develops during atherosclerosis, and this plaque builds up underneath the endothelium, and eventually it can lead to a thrombus. There's a link, isn't there, between atherosclerosis and thrombosis. Another issue can be that thrombus, that clot, it normally stays put where it is. However, a piece of the thrombus can break loose and it can start to move around the body in the blood. And if it does that, if it breaks off the thrombus, we call it an embolus. So a moving clot throughout the body is called an embolus. So these clots, the embolus moving around the body, becomes a bigger issue when it gets to narrow blood vessels, because it can block the flow of blood. It can block narrow blood vessels and stop blood flowing through these particular vessels. Now that can cause major issues if it happens within the coronary arteries. So the coronary artery supplies the heart with oxygen, the heart muscle itself with oxygen. So if that gets blocked by an embolus, we say that that's a coronary embolism or a coronary thrombosis. And that stops oxygen getting to the heart muscle, and that causes a heart attack. A similar thing can happen in the artery to the brain. It can block the artery to the brain and stop the supply of oxygen for the brain, and that can cause a stroke. PVD, or peripheral vascular disorders, peripheral vascular disease. So this is basically atherosclerosis, the process of atherosclerosis taking place in arteries that are in the periphery or the extremity of the body. So it's not the main arteries of the body. It's not the aorta or the coronary artery or the carotid artery that supplies the heart or the brain. So it initially might not seem as serious because it doesn't cause a heart attack and it doesn't cause a stroke. But the buildup of an atheroma can restrict blood flow, and it can reduce how much oxygen is getting to certain cells within that part of the body, and that causes extreme pain. Another disease or condition is called DVT, or deep vein thrombosis. So when a thrombus or a blood clot develops inside a vein, usually deep in the body, it's quite common in the leg. This can cause real pain and swelling of that particular part of the body. And it can be even worse if the thrombus breaks off and it becomes an embolus. The embolus can travel through the body and it can become what's called a pulmonary embolism. So it can get blocked within the pulmonary artery, and obviously that can be extremely serious. The next diagram just shows that happening. So we've got the thrombus developing here within the vein. So that's deep vein thrombosis. We've got part of the thrombus breaking off. So that's the embolus. And then we see that blood clot, the embolus, traveling through the body, and it gets stuck in the pulmonary artery, which obviously causes major issues. So again, pause the tape, have a look at the key learning points. I think you'll need to rewind this video quite a few times. think really carefully what your specific questions are and get in touch with your teacher.